Hello and welcome back to AP Psychology. I'm Miss Lee. In this video, we're going to continue with Unit 4 Learning, and this video is Section 2 Classical Conditioning. I am so excited to introduce this to you. Our learning targets are to identify the contributions of key researchers in the psychology of learning, specifically Ivan Pavlov, and we're going to talk about lots of different basic phenomena associated with classical conditioning. So acquisition, extinction, spontaneous recovery, generalization, stimulus discrimination, higher order learning, unconditioned stimulus, unconditioned response, neutral or conditioned stimulus, and conditioned response. You will know what all of those terms mean by the end of this video. If you haven't done so already, go ahead and grab your notes and let's get started. All right, so you may recall in our last video, we were talking about association being one of the foundations of learning. And in this video, we're introducing stimulus learning. This is learning to associate one stimulus with another, not one stimulus and its response. This is very important that you understand that. All of that will become clear to you as we continue. For instance, we associate thunder with lightning and therefore wince at the sight of lightning. We do not associate the wince of thunder with lightning. Those are two different things. All right, so classical conditioning is learning whereby a neutral stimulus comes to bring about a response after it's paired with a stimulus that naturally brings about a response. It's a lot of words. What do you think that means? Go ahead and in your notes, put that down in your own words. What do you think that means? All right, let's talk about Ivan Pavlov. Our ideas of classical conditioning originate from old philosophical theories. However, it was a Russian physiologist, not a psychologist, Ivan Pavlov, who introduced classical conditioning to the world. In classical conditioning, learning occurs when a neutral stimulus comes to bring about a response after it's paired with a stimulus that already brings about a response for something else. But it is the stimuli that are being associated here. It is not the response. In Pavlov's classic experiment, first of all, he wasn't a psychologist. Instead, he was a physiologist, and he was trying to understand the digestive process. He actually won a Nobel Prize for this research later on. But he stumbled across classical conditioning during his research. His actual research was going awry because the dogs were actually salivating before the food was put into their mouth. So this conundrum was kind of messing up his results. Before we move on, you need to understand that the stimulus is a thing that the subject responds to. The response is the reaction or an action that's related to the stimulus. So first the stimulus, then the response. Unconditioned means that it's naturally existing. It's unlearned. You don't have to have anything happen for you to already have that response. So, for example, if you flinch to pain in your mouth at the dentist, you naturally do so if it's the first time that's ever happened. You haven't been taught to respond that way. You naturally flinch in relation to pain. But conditioned means that it's learned or it's been taught. So, for example, you had to learn the value of money before you learned you would work hours and hours to make it at your new part-time job. The unconditioned stimulus leads to the unconditioned response. So the pain leads to flinching. The food leads to salivation. The conditioned stimulus, once the individual has been conditioned, leads to the conditioned response. But here's the thing, it's the same behavior. Whether it's conditioned or unconditioned, what you're looking at is, has there been an association made? The neutral stimulus elicits no response at first. Then it becomes a conditioned response after the association has taken place. I'm going to give you some examples in just a second. So the unconditioned response and the conditioned response are almost always the same. So like I just said, the unconditioned response and the conditioned response are almost always the same. For example, if you acquired food poisoning after you ate at McDonald's and you puked, and now you get nauseous just thinking about a Big Mac, you have made an association. And so just thinking about the Big Mac is a thought. It is considered a neutral stimulus until you have associated it. So let's talk a little bit more about Pavlov's experiment. So Pavlov's dogs. He started out when he noticed that the dogs were salivating before they were actually presented with the food. he kind of got a little idea and he would ring a bell. Actually, it was a tuning fork, if we're just being honest. Then he would present the food a split second later. It was very, very quick. The dogs would salivate every single time. So they began to associate the two stimuli together. The neutral stimulus of the tuning fork, that did not elicit a response at first, but when it was associated with the unconditioned stimulus of the food being presented, the unconditioned response became a conditioned response. So this phase of pairing the neutral stimulus, which becomes the conditioned stimulus, and the unconditioned stimulus over and over again until the subject associates that, is called acquisition. So you are acquiring an association. It's something that was not there before, but it's acquired. It's acquisition. And a few things to remember about acquisition. The neutral stimulus has to come before the unconditioned stimulus in most cases. I'll get to that exception in just a few moments. The time between the stimuli should be about a half a second, so very quick. After repeatedly presenting the neutral stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus, the only way to know if conditioning has happened is to present only the conditioned stimulus, or that stimulus that doesn't normally have a reaction or a response. That's when you are going to know, if it does have a response, that learning has occurred. So going back to our example, if conditioning was successful, you only present the stimulus that did not have an original reaction. If they respond, there's success. So the bell or the tuning fork, now it's the conditioned stimulus because there has been an association. The dog salivates, that is a conditioned response. Learning has occurred. All right, so let's talk about this chart. This is a very daunting chart, but it won't be in just a few moments. The key that you have to remember here are what these letters stand for. Unconditioned stimulus leads to an unconditioned response. A neutral stimulus originally leads to no response, okay? This is at the get-go. This is at the beginning, before any association has happened. After association happens, the neutral stimulus is paired with the unconditioned stimulus, which leads to an unconditioned response. When those stimuli have been associated, that becomes a conditioned stimulus. The neutral stimulus becomes a conditioned stimulus, and then the response is a conditioned response. So let's go through this with the example. Food is the unconditioned stimulus. It is going to elicit salivation as an unconditioned response. The dog does not have to learn or associate anything for food to cause salivation. Originally, that sound of the tuning fork did not elicit a response. Nothing changed, nothing happened. However, when Pavlov started to ring the bell or the tuning fork, and he paired that with the food, the dogs began to salivate with the paired stimuli. What then happened is association. So the tuning fork would elicit salivation. The conditioned stimulus, because now the dogs have learned, so it's conditioned, has led to a conditioned or learned response of salivation. Let's use another example. Okay, so you may be in an old house where every time someone flushes a toilet, the shower becomes very hot or very cold and causes the person in the shower to jump back. So what are the different elements here that we're talking about? First of all, the unconditioned stimulus is hot water. Hot water is going to automatically make someone jump back. The toilet flushing originally does not have a response. It's not something that's going to elicit anything happening. Nobody's going to jump back. It's just going to be a toilet flushing. However, when you pair a toilet flushing, which is the neutral stimulus, with hot water happening, you're going to have the unconditioned response of jumping back. Learning happens, association. Then the toilet flushing is going to make someone have a response, a conditioned response. So the conditioned stimulus of toilet flushing. You have learned that the toilet flushing is going to lead to hot water, and that's going to make you automatically jump back as a conditioned response. Other examples, advertisements that pair an attractive person with a product, bells ringing to end class, that's a classic, and anxiety whenever you hear the sound of your dentist drill. Have you ever noticed that dentist drills have a very specific sound? And yes, it can cause anxiety. But when you think about it, a sound shouldn't by itself cause anxiety. It's the association that you make with it that is causing the anxiety. The anxiety becomes a conditioned response. All right, a couple more terms. All right, a couple more terms. Extinction. This is when the unconditioned stimulus or food does not follow the conditioned stimulus of a tone. These are our examples from Pavlov again. The conditioned response or salivation starts to decrease, and that's shown in this chart on your screen. At some point, it becomes extinct, so it stops. Spontaneous recovery is a really interesting phenomenon, and we actually see this in counseling sometimes. After a rest period, an extinguished conditioned response, salivation, could spontaneously recover, and if the conditioned stimulus or the tone persists alone, it could become extinct again. So there's a period of rest time there where maybe the association kind of pops its head back up, so to speak. We see this when people have learned a different response. Sometimes we tend to kind of fall back into old habits, expecting a good response, and it doesn't always happen that way. We call it something a little bit different in therapy, but it's kind of the same phenomenon. Stimulus generalization. This is the tendency to respond to stimuli that's similar enough. It reaches the threshold just enough to the conditioned stimulus, and that is called generalization. So an example would be if dogs salivated to a horn as well as the bell that they were first conditioned to respond to. Pavlov actually tested this by conditioning dogs to salivate to small vibrations on their thigh. So instead of a bell, he was using a feeling. It wasn't even a sound, it was a feeling. The dog still salivated to vibrations on parts of the body near the thigh. However, the salivation did actually drop the farther away from the thigh the vibrations got. So as the location of the vibrations moved away from the original conditioning location, the dog's salivation did decrease. Stimulus discrimination. Discrimination is the learned ability to distinguish between a conditioned stimulus and other stimuli that do not signal an unconditioned stimulus. Pavlov tested this by ringing different tones on a tuning fork to teach discrimination. Another example would be if you got bit by a German Shepherd, but you're not scared of a Golden Retriever. So you may automatically have anxiety, your hands start shaking, your palms start sweating when you see a German Shepherd, but not a Golden Retriever. That is discrimination. It's stimulus discrimination. You can tell the difference. All right, so we're going to see some examples of what this actually looks like.
Stop it! Ellie, stop! Get out of my room! Hi, Mom.
Okay, so that's a really funny example. And look, I am not telling you to condition a sibling in any way, shape, or form. However, that example does show really how this works. This does work. Okay, one more example.
I have to reboot again. Hey, Dwight, do you want an Altoid? What do you think? Dwight, want an Altoid? Okay. Altoid? Sure. What are you doing? What?
I don't know. Well, my mouth tastes so bad all of a sudden.
Okay, so that was a classic example of classical conditioning with none other but stars of The Office. I had no choice. It's amazing. So that's it for part 1 of classical conditioning. We're going to extend our understanding of classical conditioning in our next video. I can't wait to see you then. Bye for now.